these are names that are coming up again today to justify the expansion of power and the loss of freedom, as if this is our heritage and we should be proud that we have leaders today that we can compare to these great men of the past.
Some of those closest to Obama and some of his loudest media cheerleaders are advising him to look backwards towards FDR's New Deal for inspiration.
The idea of a New Deal has crossed the lips of countless Democrats in the past 6 months. As Massachusetts Congressman Jim McGovern recently said, "I think we could be on the edge of an era in this country of bold, dramatic change equal to the Great Society and the New Deal." An aide close to Obama told New York Magazine that a lot of people around Barack are reading books about FDR's first 100 days. A kind of New Deal mania has gripped the pundit class.
It's the New Deal, and it's Barack Obama as FDR.
No, I want him to call for something like a New Deal.
But what if everything we think we know about the New Deal is wrong? What if FDR's massive intervention into the American economy actually prolonged the Great Depression?
When Obama was elected, many were quick to liken him to Abraham Lincoln. Both were eloquent intellectuals who became president during national turmoil without much political experience. Many folks don't remember that President Lincoln also had a bad midterm election.
Absolutely.
How did he react to it compared to how President Obama?
Reminds me of another second inaugural Lincoln's. So much of Lincoln in that speech, from the Gettysburg Address to the second inaugural itself, I thought was interesting was an attempt to draw a balance. Of course, he's a man of the progressive side, but he tried to draw a balance there between a government ruled by an elite and then a government ruled by a mob, both being a problem. And he talked about the government that we want, which is infrastructure, education, regulation, all the good things, and then recognize that government can't solve all the problems. I thought that was a reaching out, if you will, shouted a bit to the Tea Party right that's rejectionist.
Well, one constituency that has never deserted President Obama is Hollywood, and victory will have cheered perhaps his most high-profile supporter in Tinseltown, the director Steven Spielberg. Next week, he's releasing a film based on one of the most celebrated occupants of the White House, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln stars the British actor Daniel Day-Lewis as the Civil War president leading the fight against slavery.
Abolishing slavery settles the fate for the millions now in bondage, and unborn millions to come.
It's either the amendment or this Confederate peace you cannot.
It's based on the book Lincoln, Team of Rivals, a book read by Obama when he became president. It's said to have given him the idea of bringing into his cabinet his one-time foe, Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State. The book's author, presidential historian Doris Kearns Goodwin, joins us now from New York. Doris Kearns Goodwin, thank you very much for joining us. Now, we know that Obama very much aspires to follow the kind of Lincoln example, uniting the country after Civil War. And yet here is a country that is deeply divided, as this election describes, and of course logjam on Capitol Hill. He's not yet Lincoln, is he?
No, I think there's going to be two big challenges for him. The first is that he does have to reach symbolically across the aisle. He has to do almost what LBJ did, which is to bring in as many of those Republicans and Democrats to the White House, lunch, dinner, breakfast, just begin to create those relationships. But if the obstructionism still lasts, then he has to go to the public, which he did last night, force them to force the Congress to do something by using the outside pressure to get Congress inside to have to finally act.
Well, now, you've been into the White House to see him on regular intervals. I'm just wondering whether you personally feel a bit disappointed by the first 4 years and whether you now think the second 4 years still have a chance of doing what Lincoln achieved.
Oh, I have no doubt that he has learned from those first 4 years. That's all you really ask of a president. I mean, think of it. If Lincoln had not won a second term, he'd be remembered as the president who didn't win the Civil War. If FDR hadn't won a second term, he had not ended the Depression. And the great thing about having the chance again after you've had it for 4 years is you can learn what didn't work well. So my guess is that having learned from those, and Lincoln was a man who learned from his errors, was able to grow in that job, was able to grow in that job, was able to grow in that job. And if that's what Obama can do, then that second term could be pretty special.
There's a lot of people today in the mainstream media who clearly haven't learned from history, who are telling us about the importance of learning from history. And here's what I mean. We had the inauguration last week. I remember 4 years ago, there was this real theme of FDR and the Great Depression. Paul Krugman calling for the New Deal. Everyone talking about Obama as the new FDR. Time magazine ran a cover where they had actually photoshopped Obama to look like FDR. And at that time, or right up into the present day, I was kind of wondering if you had any strategies or you had any experience trying to calm down somebody's excitement, knowing what you know about the Great Depression, when they say, yes, here comes Obama to save us, or here, not just Obama the man, but here comes these ideas, here comes these Keynesian ideas to save us from this economic downturn. Do you have an elevator speech that you can give to somebody who's really, really charged up about that kind of stuff to set them straight?
You mean focusing specifically on what history can tell us, like from the FDR years?
Yes.
Well, I would say this. There are people who try to claim that, after all, Roosevelt's New Deal got us out of the Great Depression. There are some historians who are honest enough to admit that he didn't get us out of the Depression, but that with those programs, but that World War II did. That's a separate question. And I have a whole page of resources explaining, including a video that I did at libertyclassroom.com/war that deals with the World War II thing. But on the New Deal in particular, the historians who claim that it did have good effects, that economic growth did pick up, and sure, unemployment was in the double digits, but it was better than it was when he took office years and years earlier. The basic answer to this is, well, the United States has recovered from every economic downturn it ever had, right? There was always a recovery that came after. So it's not enough to say, well, there was a recovery, therefore FDR caused it. Then how do you account for all the other recoveries when the federal government did not intervene at all? Like there was no intervention after the Panic of 1837. There was no intervention after the Panic of 1857. The federal government didn't do anything after the Panic of 1873. Like, how did they get out of those things? There was no FDR around that. So it's not enough to say things got better. They always get better. The point is, they got better much, much more slowly and sluggishly in the 1930s than at any time ever before. And that happens to be the one time that the federal government was constantly intervening with prices, with wages, with productions, with work hours, with production rules, with cartels, with agriculture, with whatever, with the money supply, whatever it is, taxes, all over the place. Now, that could just be a coincidence, but I somehow don't think that the other side of this argument would allow us to make the argument if the case were reversed. Suppose it were the case that in all the previous recessions in U.S. history, there had been a Franklin Roosevelt and a New Deal, and we got out of those quickly. And then the first time we really languished in depression, that was because we had a terrible free market guy who just wouldn't intervene. Do you think they would allow us to claim, look, that's just a coincidence? The one time we didn't intervene, it just happened to go on forever. They would say, no, that's because of your stupid free market and because you didn't intervene. How come they don't allow us to reverse the argument when, in fact, the reality is the opposite? The reality is the recovery occurs usually pretty swiftly in all these other cases with no government involvement. The one time it's drawn out is when the government gets involved. Maybe that's not a coincidence. And then I go in to give some of the specific arguments to justify this conclusion in the books you mentioned, The Politically Incorrect Guide to American History and 33 Questions About American History You're Not Supposed to Ask. These are at my website, tomwoods.com.
You know, right up to the modern day, we did have this inauguration last week. Last March, I think Tim Burton, bear with me here for a second, Tim Burton released a movie called Abraham Lincoln Vampire Slayer. Then some months go by, and Steven Spielberg puts out an even more far-fetched movie. And I say that because it's based on the work of Doris Kearns Goodwin about the presidency of Lincoln during the Civil War. Then we hear this talk about a civil war in the United States over the gun issue. Then Obama is going to get sworn in on Lincoln's Bible. And then he is sworn in. People start comparing his second inaugural address to Lincoln's second inaugural address. And I start to say, man, things are getting pretty Lincoln-y around here. And that kind of scares me. The same way I was a little bit apprehensive about all the tie-ins that Hollywood and the mainstream media did with Obama and Roosevelt during his first term. So just speak to the Lincoln thing for a minute, because one of the things that scares me about that is both parties want to claim Lincoln as their own. And it seems to be that the lesson with Lincoln is that there's no abuse or overreach of presidential power that could not be justified for some kind of greater good. And I know I've heard you talk about maybe more of the blame for getting away from the constraints of executive power lies with Teddy Roosevelt, but Lincoln is a part of that too.
Yeah.
And people want to claim Lincoln as their own, I think, for that reason.
Yeah, well, my emphasis on Teddy Roosevelt is because he did it during peacetime when it was much harder for presidents to get away with that sort of thing. In wartime conditions, there's always some excuse why the president has to have such and such power. Now, on Lincoln, I personally think Tom DiLorenzo has done excellent work and on this subject with his books. And he's not digging up stuff that people don't know, that historians don't know. He's digging up stuff that the general public doesn't know. And it tells rather a different story from the comic book version that we get. And now, of course, we're all taught that, well, we needed Lincoln to free the slaves. The point is, Lincoln wasn't – I take him at his word that he was opposed to slavery. Even though he was not viewed as an abolitionist. Frederick Douglass did not think of him as an abolitionist. He referred to him as the white man's president. He liked Lincoln, but he was honest about who the man really was. We know now, because of recent research by a guy named Philip Magnus of American University, that it wasn't that he did not abandon the idea of colonizing the freed slaves or in the middle of the war, which a lot of historians had claimed, all the way up to the very bitter end. He was desperately looking for some place he could send these people because they absolutely could not be integrated into American society. No school kid is learning about any of that. Lincoln made perfectly clear that he would have been absolutely at peace if the southern states had continued to have slavery and if a constitutional amendment had been passed that would forever prohibit the abolition of slavery at any time in the future. Lincoln said this, that he had absolutely no objection to that. He believed that was already constitutional law, so codifying it further caused him no difficulty. Lincoln believed in the nationalist rather than the compact theory of the Union. The nationalist theory is false, and yet we are living with the consequences of it today, because now every time the federal government wants to oppress us or oppress the states, it points to Lincoln for its inspiration. And we live in a system now where the states believe they have no ability to resist the federal government. They have to just lie down and take it. This was not the American tradition. This was the French Revolutionary tradition, but presumably the United States is supposed to be different from other countries.
Right.
So political centralization and crony capitalism and also violations of the laws of war and jailing the legislature of Maryland to make sure they couldn't vote to secede. And one just goes on and on and on. And there's always some excuse that, there was a greater good. That greater good didn't even occur to Lincoln until a year and a half into the war. And even then, he did it entirely as a war measure. And you say, well, who cares? At least we got it. That is true. That is a very, very important silver lining of this, but let's also remember that every other country in the Western Hemisphere that ended slavery did it without bloodshed in the 19th century. Every single one managed to do it. So unless you're going to claim the United States was uniquely savage, presumably there must have been some other way to do this. But finally, I would just say that Lincoln is an instrument in bringing about and helping to give greater impetus to centralized governments around the world. And what did that give us? Yes, it's true that a large, powerful, centralized government can indeed do away with oppressions at the local level. It can get rid of slavery with just a snap of its fingers. But at the same time, it can also conscript you into the military. It can engage in genocide. If we look at just World War I alone, the number of people who died in World War I was greater than the number of slaves there were in the entire South. And that was what was made possible by these centralized governments. So yes, they can do some good. That's true. At least, there's some silver lining to them. But the record of the 20th century in general is not very favorable to them.